This is the fifth week that President Trump has been in court for this sham of a trial. They are doing this intentionally to keep him here and keep him off of the campaign trail. And I think everybody in the country can see that for what it is.
That was Speaker of the House, Republican Mike Johnson, talking to reporters outside the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse last week, repeating Donald Trump's favorite lines: the hush money trial is a sham and everyone knows it. Reality suggests otherwise. According to a new CBS poll, 56% of Americans believe Trump is definitely or probably guilty of a crime in this case. What is true, though, is that the Speaker's decision to appear outside the Manhattan courtroom and attack the judicial branch is emblematic of the complete capitulation of Republican leadership to Donald Trump. As the Washington Post editorial board notes, in hindsight, the Stormy Daniels and the Access Hollywood tape episode was the beginning of Mr. Trump's unconditional hold on the Republican base and the beginning of the end for what was left of the traditional GOP. I am back with George Conway, Charles Coleman, and Anna Bower. Thank you all for being here. George, I butchered the quote, but I do wonder what you think of it. Is this, I mean, in some ways, this represents bookends of the Trumpification of the Republican Party, Access Hollywood and Stormy Daniels being the beginning, and the Speaker of the House coming to the rescue of a potential felon outside a Manhattan courtroom.
Well, they always manage to sink lower. I mean, here you have the Speaker of the House of Representatives of the United States of America, who is a conservative evangelical Christian, telling outright lies about a trial in defense of an adjudicated rapist who he knows lies in almost everything he does, and is. No, this isn't a sham trial. The evidence is there. The grand jury indicted him. What does he have to say about the evidence that involves, not really in dispute, the person he's lying for, this conservative Christian evangelical, who paid off a porn star that he had sex with, very briefly, and then covered it up with a payoff? I mean, what is he saying is the lie there? He's lying, and he's lying in defense of a pathological liar and criminal, and as I mentioned, an adjudicated rapist. You just can't sink any lower than that. And this is, I mean, the entire right has succumbed to this level of degeneracy and treats it as normal and just pretends it doesn't exist. It's absolutely appalling.
Yeah, it is not normal. I think it bears repeating. And I do wonder, Anna, you've spent time in the courtroom. You've been following this religiously almost. The effect that all of this is having on the jury, I mean, they're obviously not outside the courtroom, but there's been this parade of Trump allies through the courtroom. And this, the Trump of it all. Can you give us a sense of how the jury has been processing this from what you've been able to see inside the courtroom and in the overflow room?
Right. Well, look, I can't get inside the jurors' minds, but I can tell you that sometimes whenever the parade of Trump's entourage comes in, it can be disruptive. There was a moment even at a sidebar that we learned from the transcript later on in which prosecutors asked Justice Merchan to ensure that perhaps people who are coming into the courtroom during trial proceedings could, do so more quietly because their security services were following them, all of that. So there's that element to it where it is a little bit distracting. I'm sure it is not lost on the jurors who are watching these political figures come into the courtroom every day. And then what also is likely not lost on the jurors is the fact that there are some notable absences from that courtroom, particularly Melania Trump, as well as Trump's daughters, Ivanka, Tiffany. None of those people have been there while Trump's sons have attended the trial on some days. This is a case in which the defense is arguing that Trump cares about his family, that he cared about his reputation and his relationship with his wife. And they're arguing that through their cross-examination and through their case to the jurors. And yet all the while, Melania Trump is not there. So it really is a striking absence sitting there in the courtroom. And I'm sure that is not lost on the jurors. jurors.
Anna, let me just ask you one more question, because the jurors have not been talking amongst themselves. Is that right? I mean, we haven't seen any interaction there, which is, I would assume, making it even harder to understand what the dynamics are among that group of 12 people.
That's right. And I will say there are a few jurors where I've noticed that maybe one or two will kind of smile at each other at certain moments. But there's, especially during the trial proceedings, they are very engaged. They are paying attention, looking at, just the witness and the prosecutor or the defense counsel who's doing the questioning. They're not talking amongst themselves. So we really don't have much of an idea of what the dynamic there is. And they're also not supposed to be, speaking about the case to each other or to other people. The judge every day when we leave gives them instructions to that effect. So we don't have much insight into the dynamics, although we do know a few things. For example, there are two lawyers on this jury. And so you have to wonder exactly how that could affect the dynamic within the deliberation room when they eventually do get there. Are these two lawyers people who will kind of be natural leaders among the jury in terms of explaining this very complicated legal theory?
No matter what the outcome is, Charles, it's very clear that Donald Trump doesn't want to have to go through this again. Rolling Stone, I mean, to some degree, I understand, but the remedies he's seeking are unprecedented, right? Rolling Stone is reporting that Trump wants lawmakers to pass legislation to keep him out of jail forever. It's a twofold strategy. One, asking them to pass a law to shield former presidents from prosecution forever. And two, give former presidents the option of moving state or local prosecutions into a federal court instead. That's something he tried to do in Georgia. What is your reaction to that strategy?
Well, I find it interesting because for as much as people said that Donald Trump did not understand government during his first term in office, it's very clear that since that time, he has learned how to use the legislature as a sword and a shield, and he intends to do so going forward. We all know that part of the reason why Donald Trump is running for the White House is because he wants to avoid landing in the big house. But at the end of the day, even if that is not something that he has direct control over, what he knows he can do is apply pressure to not only the legislature, but also to the judiciary, where he has a supermajority on the Supreme Court that will do hopefully some of the things, if not all of the things that he wants them to do. I thought it was very interesting in your lead-in. You talked about the fact that Mar-a-Lago, for example, the federal case in Florida with the documents, is the most straightforward case that federal prosecutors have, and perhaps any of the cases that he's facing. And simultaneously, it's the case where he's getting the most help from the bench in terms of Eileen Cannon, a Trump-appointed judge who has basically put that trial on hold. So when I look at all of this, Alex, what I see is someone who really understands I need to attack this problem on multiple fronts, leave no stone unturned, and create every opportunity for myself to stay out of court any further.
Well, and he's banking, George, on the fact that, you had the Speaker of the House and enough Republicans standing on the courthouse steps that they had to push off a vote on a bill to hold Merrick Garland in contempt down in Washington, D.C. He has the support of the Republican conference in the House. And is it so far-fetched to imagine that they would pass a law that's, by the way, already been a bill that's already been drafted to make sure he's immune from prosecution forever? Yeah,
I mean, I think the House would probably pass it. I mean, the House is completely in the thrall of Donald Trump. And they probably pass by one or two votes, the margin that they have. But I don't think it would pass the Senate. I don't think they would have all of even the Republican senators to sign on to that bill. I think there are plenty of Republican senators who would find it completely repulsive. But I agree with Charles. I mean, he will use this is all about Trump. Trump is running for president to stay out of the big house, as Charles said. He is going to use every lever of government or politics, anything, or the media, to stay out of jail. And then, if he manages to become president and to stay out of jail, to wreak vengeance upon everyone who crossed him. And that's what Donald Trump is about, because Donald Trump is just about himself. He's a narcissistic sociopath. He has no morals, no conscience, no remorse. And he's the only one in his own world, and he's the only one he cares about. And, the government be damned. Soldiers who died for their country, they're suckers and losers. Everyone else doesn't count in the mind of Donald Trump, and certainly the The rule of law doesn't.
Here we are. George Conway, Charles Coleman, and Anna Bower, thank you all for spending your Friday Memorial Weekend Eve with me and giving us the goods on what you think is going to happen. I really appreciate your time and wisdom. Enjoy your weekends, friends.